southeast, and thanks to inviting to Bronze Age, hopefully I will do it justice. Slightly moved away from the original title, but the presentation is going to be a bit of a journey through 100 years of Sussex archaeology, touching on a very downland-centric view in the sort of 60s, incorporating some lowland Sussex as we get past the 80s, but also going to be a bit of a journey through time, through the Middle and the Late Bronze Age, and looking at changes across that period. So we are looking at Middle and Late Bronze Age, that's covering, say, 1600 to 800 BC, and we're going to be looking at these four main site types to sort of better understand the society and landscape. So we'll get started, jumping back into the 1930s with Curwen's excavations at New Barn Down, potentially one of the first of what became quite a recognisable site type. These Middle Bronze Age Devil-Rimbri settlements on south-facing slopes of the South Downs, very visible earthworks and very well-defined roundhouses, as you can see on the left, and these roundhouses quite commonly associated with votive deposition. And Curwen also recorded that this site was very much associated with a wider landscape. These are the lynchetted field systems and trackways that form part of the wider landscape. And I don't know if you can just about see in that left photo that you can still see that is the settlement here in the foreground. So very much recognised in the 1930s the extent of some of these Middle Bronze Age landscapes in the Downs. Similarly, in the wider downland landscape, these lynchetted field systems were really being recognised and recorded. This is sort of between the World Wars, but also post the World Wars. The damage that was being done to them by modern agriculture was very much evident, and there were big efforts to map and record these landscapes before they were destroyed. To give you a bit of an illustration about how widespread some of these prehistoric systems were in the Downs, this is an image from The Secret of the High Woods from north of Chichester, illustrating just quite how extensive the exploitation of the Downs was. They're not all prehistoric, some of those are Roman, but I think it gives you an idea of how wide that exploitation was. And then moving into the 1940s, excavations at High Down Hill, one of the smaller hill forts in Sussex at about 1 hectare, but some extensive earthworks, and gold penannular ring was also recorded in association with High Down Hill. And around this time, hill forts very much interpreted as possibly elite residences. High Down Hill in particular, because of its association with metalworking and the gold loop. Moving into the 1950s, Itford Hill, originally excavated in the 1950s, another of these Middle Bronze Age Devil-Rimbri settlements. Enclosed, initially interpreted as a very large settlement, but more recently it's been very much understood as multiple phases of settlement. Something that becomes quite recognisable in late Bronze Age settlements is this frequent rebuilding of structures on adjacent plots. And similarly, quite nicely evident at Itford Hill, this pairing of buildings where you get a larger roundhouse with a smaller ancillary structure, which very much becomes evident in most late Bronze Age settlements. Moving on to Black Patch, also in about the 1950s, but published here by Druitt in the 1980s. Another example of these well-defined Devil-Rimbri Middle Bronze Age settlements, again enclosed with a palisade, quite heavy in artefacts. And interestingly, at Black Patch, one of the first examples that I could find where radiocarbon dating has actually illustrated that one of the buildings was used for about 200 years, quite different to other examples where there's been quite frequent rebuilding within a short space of time. We're sort of summarising at this point that we're into 1950s, but we're still very much lacking late Bronze Age domestic architecture. Alongside this, I think also the 1950s original excavations at Harting Beacon on the other end of the spectrum of Bronze Age hill forts in Sussex. It's about 10 hectares, sprawling earthworks, but again, gold penannular rings associated with Harting Beacon. And alongside all of this excavation is funerary monuments. Very evident on the South Downs. I've picked just a few examples here. The Hove Barrow, the amber cup from Hove Barrow, excavated in the, I think, 1850s. There's the Devil's Jumps from Chichester, and then Alfriston, one of the Alfriston barrows, excavated in the 1970s, along with Itford Hill. And at this point in time, the combination of the funerary monuments, some with exotic grave goods, the hillforts associated with gold, the lynchetted field systems and the settlements. Around the 1960s, we've landed up with a rough interpretation that society might have been relatively hierarchical, relatively similar to Iron Age Wessex, potentially elites residing in hillforts, potentially being buried in round barrows, and that the economy was very driven by the downland agriculture. But then, as touched upon by Lou and by David, big changes occur in the 70s and the 80s. This is actually jumping into the 90s. I think this is 1993 and 1994. Batcham Fawcett on the left, and Lavant in the middle and on the right. And 1993-94, we're getting the first evidence of late Bronze Age domestic architecture on the Downs. Also, 1995, we get Shinewater, Chris Grettritz's excavation in the middle of winter. And for those of you that don't know Shinewater, it's one of the first and only examples of a wetland late Bronze Age site in Sussex. Critically underfunded and very much recorded falling out of the edge of a lake after it had been quarried. We're on the northeast side of Eastbourne here, and the trackway runs across through the lake, and the platform is around about here. This is the extent of the scheduled monument on the right. And when Chris turned up, very much it was truncated timbers sticking out of the bottom of the lake. The platform is assumed to be surviving in the east here, but quite remarkable results from what was a very short period of fieldwork. This is looking at the Shinewater site in a little bit more detail. This is the timber platform sitting on top of the peat, and then this is quite a thick midden deposit. And over here we also have what looks like a half. Quite a remarkable site, the first of its kind, and associated with quite a remarkable finds assemblage. Amber beads, there's an antler cheek piece, bronze axes, and the very famous reaping hook. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this site was interpreted as obviously being very significant, maybe high status, perhaps ritual. The site was also associated with some, unfortunately, quite poorly stratified human remains. I think they were found on a spoil heap when the archaeologists turned up. And from now on, apologies, the slides are going to get very ASE biased, but moving into the 2000s, this is very much in the last decade or so, we start getting increasing evidence of later Bronze Age activity on the coastal plain. The left is Tom Munnery's site at Pagham, where we're starting to get real evidence of later Bronze Age field systems and trackways and water holes. And then Andy Marget's is Oldlands Farm in Bognor in the middle. And the illustration on the right really shows the similarities perhaps between Oldlands Farm Bognor and Plumpton Plain A, so potentially one of the first examples of this Middle Bronze Age settlement type on the coastal plain. And some more on the coastal plain, filling in that gap that we had of the late Bronze Age. Littlehampton on the left, again, one of Tom Munnery's sites, really nice, well-defined roundhouse, and a lovely well, and Medmery on the right. An amazing Bronze Age landscape, trackways, I think there's evidence of salt working and multiple roundhouses. Again, some of them showing this sort of rapid rebuilding, whilst others potentially paired structures. And it's worth saying that by this point in time, this like relatively frequent rebuilding of structures in the Bronze Age is interpreted as suggesting that actually lineage, family, isn't seen as wildly significant in society. the way it is in the Iron Age. We also start, so in 2016, 2017, some examples of Bronze Age funerary monuments on the coastal plain, really illustrating that the whole landscapes are being exploited at this time in history. One of Garrett's on the left, I think it's a Middle Bronze Age barrow, and then on the right is also a Middle Bronze Age cremation flat cemetery, excavated near Chichester, really illustrating that there are different funerary monuments in the Middle Bronze Age on the coastal plain. Still, however, a real lack of late Bronze Age funerary monuments. And in 2017, we get our first lowland hillfort in Sussex, also excavated near Chichester. And we are very much on the edge of the upper and lower coastal plain. That's the River Cliff, West Hampnet just over here. And we excavated about 50% of the enclosure, extrapolating, we think, probably about 8 hectares. Pretty monumental hill fort. This is looking north over the South Downs and the Trundle, and this is a photo of quite extensive earthworks, this one being the later Bronze Age ditch. This is actually a Middle Iron Age one. And similarly, this is the northern half of the site that we excavated, really illustrating, again, this late Bronze Age habit of frequent rebuilding of structures, and possibly this pairing of roundhouses with ancillary structures. This building is interesting in its own right. Why it's enclosed separately is curious, but also there's no suggestion of rebuilding. So perhaps repaired in situ, perhaps more significant. And it's worth saying that very much even by the 80s, hill forts were being reinterpreted with further excavation, better dating. There was very little evidence of permanent settlement within these hill forts, and dating them as the late Bronze Age, when there are no funerary monuments, very much reinterpreted as not being elite settlements, largely, bar High Down Hill perhaps. And then moving on, quickly finishing, we'll talk about Must Farm. Can't really talk about the late Bronze Age without talking about Must Farm. For those of you that don't know it, it's a settlement in the Fens, wetland site, well preserved. About half of the site was excavated, the northern half lost by quarrying before archaeologists were on site. And this site has really changed how we think about the late Bronze Age, and I think how we need to start thinking about the late Bronze Age in Sussex also. The site was occupied for just a year and developed a very thick midden deposit outside the roundhouses in a very short space of time. So how we look at other midden sites in the late Bronze Age, but also how we interpret sort of use, duration of use based on artefact assemblages is going to be an interesting one going forward. The other reason why I pulled up Must Farm is its range of artefacts. Similarly, amber bead necklaces, human remains like we had at Shinewater, and these very much stratified in midden deposits. Bronzes, bronze axes, these reaping hooks and sickles. And Must Farm's been very much interpreted as a everyday settlement, but that perhaps they got this artefact assemblage because it was abandoned so quickly. So if we're thinking about Must Farm being an everyday settlement, how does that mean that we interpret some of our sites in Sussex that have these finds assemblages, like Shinewater? Perhaps Shinewater itself is also an everyday settlement, just remarkably well preserved because of its wetland environment. So, charging to conclusions. What have I rapidly gone through there? Within 100 years, we've had major change in Sussex archaeology, particularly in the last 50 years. We've found the late Bronze Age landscape. We still have this loss of funerary monuments or visible funerary monuments. Why this change in funerary practice from the Middle to late Bronze Age, coinciding with the advent of hill forts, really suggests major change in social structure. And similarly with the reinterpretation of hill forts as not being elite settlements, well, high down hill, are we actually looking at a relatively flat but also prosperous society? What I haven't really talked about here is metalwork, and Sussex has got quite an amazing assemblage of late Bronze Age metalwork. So in no way are we saying that society wasn't affluent but relatively flat. And this isn't a very new interpretation. Sue Hamilton mentioned it in about 2003, and Alex Smith, interpreting the Middle Bronze Age in the Thames Valley, has said similarly. But I think it's quite remarkable that in 50 years we can go from such changes in the archaeological record and its interpretation. I think quite exciting that if that change can happen in 50 years, exciting to think where ASE and Bronze Age Sussex could be in 50 years' time. Thank you very much.